What's going on, everyone? I'm just a typical, average American here today to react and learn about the entire history of Canada explained in 10 minutes. So, to be completely honest, most Americans really don't know anything about Canadian history. We just tend to focus on American history here in America. So, one of the first videos I ever made on this channel was actually learning about the history of Canada in 5 minutes. But that was a long time ago, and it didn't go that much in depth, and I've probably forgotten a good bit of the things that I learned. So today, I want to check out this video explaining the history of Canada a little more in depth over 10 minutes. So let's take a look.
For many thousands of years, this region was populated with many indigenous tribes of hardy people, capable of overcoming the severe and lengthy winters.
Wow, we're going back to the beginning. We are starting at the very beginning. I mean, that's great. Exactly what I was hoping for. Right. Before like modern Canada as you know it, before modern United States as we know it, there were the indigenous inhabitants of these lands, the people who were originally located there.
Thriving and developing unique cultures. The first non-native people to settle in Canada, and the New World in general that we know of for sure, were the Vikings. They built a settlement in Newfoundland around 1000 AD.
The Canadians... Okay, this is a curveball. I don't remember this. The first people in Canada were Vikings? It could have been Leif Erikson. I've heard that name before. Vikings in Newfoundland. Does that mean Canadians are descended from Vikings? Is that possible? Because that's pretty cool if that's a thing.
It is unclear for exactly how long this settlement was occupied for, or if there was more, but ultimately it was either abandoned, pillaged, or its inhabitants succumbed to disease, or assimilated into the local population. But theories abound. Nearly 500 years later, in 1497, the Italian explorer Giovanni Capoto was the first European to explore North America's coast.
Now we have an Italian explorer. First we had Vikings who came and kind of went one way or another. Now we have an Italian explorer from Europe. Okay.
Claiming it for the English crown. Shortly after, the Spanish and the Portuguese would do the same, but remained uncolonized for several decades, with only a few seasonal Portuguese and Basque fishing outposts built.
So people from different European countries came, technically, to Canada. Nothing really happened at that point. We're talking like 500 years ago. Not that long ago in the grand scheme of things, but maybe they set up some fishing outposts, but nothing really happened. People came and were like, land, a new place. And then we're like, okay, sounds good. This is England's now. And then kind of went away and just kind of put a pin in it. Save Canada for later.
Until the French arrived. Jacques Cartier claiming the land for France in 1534. He named the Gulf and river after St. Lawrence's feast day on which he arrived. The French called the territory around the river Canada, after the native word for settlement. After several failed attempts at permanent settlement succumbed to starvation and disease, the cities of Quebec and Port Royal were successfully established.
Oh my God, look at this. Are these are these like recreations of old Quebec and Port Royal? And the French came. Yes, that sounds familiar to me. And it makes complete sense because there's obviously a whole big part of Canada that has a French history and speaks French to this day. Okay. It turns out it's actually pretty hard to start a new country or nation, but eventually it happened, and this name Kanata came about. Some of this sounds familiar to me.
By 1670, the English colonies in the South had expanded, and new settlements were established in Newfoundland and south of the Hudson Bay. The fur trade, particularly in beaver pelts, became extremely lucrative, as it became the favored material for hat makers and luxury winter clothing in northern Europe.
Beaver
This greatly
pelts.
encouraged further northern settlement by both English and French fur trappers seeking to make a fortune.
Okay.
The French and the English
Canada was in part founded on beaver pelts. That's not even a joke. That's literally the truth. Most Americans would have thought maple syrup. Beaver pelts is where it's at.
did not peacefully coexist, with the French temporarily taking much of the territory around the Hudson Bay during the lengthy period known as the Beaver Wars. Not only the Europeans became wealthy and influential from the trade in beaver pelts, the Iroquois Confederation of 6 powerful tribes, armed with European firearms, initially allied with Dutch merchants, and then the English, to aggressively attack the French and most other Indian tribes in the region to obtain more furs.
You know, you know I was going to make a joke about that name, but I'm going to try to control myself. The Beaver Wars, although having a funny name, it actually sounds very serious, with a lot of death and destruction, and it was the French trying to like build a life in Canada versus the native Canadians and all these tribes who actually had guns. Not a lot of Americans would imagine native indigenous tribes as being primitive, having like axes. It's like no, they had like literal firearms and stuff. So this was very serious business.
Many of these tribes banded together with the French to halt Iroquois expansion. Peace was negotiated after 72 years of fighting,
Wow.
and many, mostly Indian lives lost.
Wow.
A little territorial change. The region of New France was comprised of several colonies. Canada and Louisiana were the largest, along with the smaller Plaisance and Acadia, which the British Empire obtained from the French in the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 in a complicated agreement concerning the War of Spanish Succession.
Wait. Okay, that was like 30 seconds and a lot happened. This is New France, which is Canada and Louisiana? I'm learning stuff about the United States because I didn't know any part of the United States had anything to do with Canadian colonization or forming, and there's this Acadia I've heard of before. Maybe I have to listen to this one more time to be completely fair.
France was comprised of
Okay, New France.
Indian
Yes.
lives lost, and little territorial change. The region of New France was comprised of several colonies. Canada and Louisiana were the largest,
Wow.
along with the smaller Plaisance and Acadia, which
Okay.
the British Empire obtained from the French in the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 in a complicated agreement concerning the War of Spanish Succession.
This is all New France. It went all the way down into the United States, the modern day United States. I had no idea about that.
France also recognized the legitimacy of the Hudson Bay Company's claim over Rupert's Land. Interestingly, the Hudson Bay Company is still in existence today, primarily as owners of a retail store chain bearing their name.
heck?
Despite their large
What the heck? What the heck? The Hudson's Bay? I don't think we have this, but it's like, how does that still exist today? And it's just like a shopping center. That's funny.
Despite their larger territory, the French increasingly became outnumbered by the rapidly growing British colonies surrounding them, by a margin of 10 to 1 by the time the next major conflict between the two occurred. During the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as it has become known in much of North America, French-speaking Acadians were deported far from the Canadian borderlands, some of whom formed the basis of much of the Cajun population of modern-day Louisiana and New Orleans.
I didn't know about that. People from Acadia had to, by force or by necessity, move to modern-day Louisiana, they said? And their descendants are still there to this day.
Both English and French empires sent thousands of regular infantry to North America during the war, supported by local militias and Indian tribes. The greatly outnumbered French relied heavily on Indian allies and fought the British to a standstill early in the war.
The French had Indian allies, even though, wasn't there like 70 years of war? The Beaver Wars, where the French fought the native Canadians. Now they're helping the French fight the British in the... But isn't this called the French-Indian War? But they just said the Indians are teaming up with the French. Am I understanding this correctly?
relied heavily on Indian allies and fought the British to a standstill early in the war,
Yeah.
until the British successfully besieged the cities of Quebec and Montreal. Despite the French later defeating the British in a pitched battle, they failed to retake their capital city. In the treaty that ended the war soon after, France ceded Canada to Britain, while giving Louisiana Territory to her ally, Spain. It is important to note at this time much of North America's non-coastal areas were still largely unpopulated, with
Wow. You know, it's good to refresh myself on a lot of this, because a lot of this I either never learned or don't remember, or I never realized how substantial the French history was in Canada. Like, the French almost, if they had won this war, all of Canada could have been French, right? Like, if they had just won this war, but they were vastly outnumbered by the British Empire. So the British won, and that's why things are the way they are. Okay.
many of the native tribes heavily depleted through warfare and invasive diseases from which they had little immunity. With a population of approximately 3 million, the American colonies waged a successful rebellion against the British Crown. A little over a decade later, the
I know about that. I've heard of that one before.
Americans attempted and failed to take Quebec, which remained loyal to Great Britain. After the war, many British loyalists moved north into Canada. During the following War of 1812, both British and American armies launched several failed invasions of each other's territory, ending in military stalemate, and the status quo was maintained. The treaties following the war established...
Yeah, there's a lot more conflict and war between the United States and Canada, which was like, you know, also indigenous tribes, it was British military, it was Canadians, but nonetheless, a lot more conflict between Canada and America than I ever realized, honestly.
A more formalized border between the two nations. Despite the Canadians' desire not to join their American neighbors to the south, movements for self-rule increasingly grew among the Canadian lower and middle classes, culminating in the rebellions of 1837 and 38 that were severely dealt with and crushed, and saw the short-lived Republic of Canada established by William Lloyd Mackenzie. Despite the Republic's short-lived lifespan and diminutive size, widespread public support, not only from many Canadians, both French and English-speaking, but also from Americans to the south, spurred Great Britain's government to make major concessions in the rebellion's aftermath.
So there was a Republic of Canada for a short amount of time. This is still back, so the people inhabiting Canada are really like, we need to be our own thing, we need to be separated from the United States clearly, and have certain territories and boundaries set in place. But this was back when Canada was still part of the British Empire, right? That's what makes this kind of touchy. The United States just fought a war, becoming independent from the British Empire. I don't know if the British Empire was like, oh, now Canada too, man, like that kind of thing. But interesting seeing this point of view.
The Act of Union in 1840 united Upper and Lower Canada into the new province of Canada, and the granting of responsible government soon after allowed for a far greater degree of self-rule to be exercised by the elected representatives of the people. In 1846, the disputed Oregon Territory was peaceably divided between Great Britain and the United States, pretty much by drawing a straight line and giving Vancouver Island to Canada.
I mean, Vancouver, that's literally like how that part of Canada became Canada. Vancouver Island goes a little bit south. Could have been part of America, but it's not.
Throughout the 19th century, a massive boom in the logging industry fueled large waves of immigration to Canada, gradually replacing the fur trade as Canada's most lucrative industry. In 1867, the British North America Act, or more commonly called the Constitution Act today, established Canada as a self-governing democracy with Ottawa as its capital city.
Okay, now we're moving very quickly here. This is the history of Canada in only 10 minutes. We're starting to get into the modern era. Canada is being formed with proper representatives and governments. Okay.
West, the Hudson's Bay Company negotiated the sale of Rupert's Land to the newly formed Canadian government. The Métis people of mixed European, primarily French, and Indian ancestry were the largest population of the Winnipeg area of what is now Manitoba. Fearing the land they had held for generations would be seized by newcomers from the east, they rose in rebellion, creating a provisional government. And after a tense standoff, an eventual occupation by federal troops, many of their demands were met, respecting their rights.
Okay,
The leader of
good.
the rebellion, Louis Riel, would lead another larger but less successful rebellion 15 years later that ended with his trial and execution. Louis Riel became a martyr or villain to many Canadians.
Never, this is like one of those Canadian historical people moments. Never heard of this ever before. I kind of get this guy, like him and his people, like have been living in this part of southern Canada for generations, forever, and they didn't like that things were changing or they thought their land was under threat. But apparently the government made a deal with them and it was all fine. And he pushed it further and tried to spark another rebellion. Maybe he was just against the whole Canada thing. And then he was tried and executed for it.
His death increasing the tensions between Indian Métis, English, and French groups in society. Because of the key role the partially completed Transcontinental Railway played in the suppression of the rebellion, political support for completing it soared among English-speaking Canadians.
Okay.
And the railroad was completed in only 4 years.
Right, I've learned a little about this. This Transcontinental Railroad, Canada built super quick, united, Western and Eastern Canada. You can travel across Canada now. Huge deal.
From when it had begun. The 1890s saw the Klondike Gold Rush, in which over 100,000 prospectors set out to the remote Yukon region in hopes of striking it rich. Some did, but most didn't. After several decades of stagnant population growth, largely due to emigration to the United States, Canada's population sharply...
A lot of Canadians were immigrating to the United States because they said before, when the U.S. and Canada divided, a lot of British loyalists immigrated from the U.S. to Canada. A lot of people immigrated to Canada during the logging boom, maybe the gold rush, and now I'm hearing there's Canadians immigrating back to the U.S. Is there any reason why this is happening?
increased due to a good economy.
Let's roll it back a few seconds.
United States. Canada's population sharply increased due to a good economy and high foreign immigration throughout the early 20th century. During the First World War, Canada, still a dominion of the United Kingdom, sent 620,000 troops to fight in Europe.
Wow.
67,000 would die, while another 173,000 would be wounded.
Wow.
The staggering casualty rate grieved and shocked the nation. The war had a strong impact on Canadian nationalism and the desire to self-govern its own international affairs, which they obtained when the British Parliament passed the Statute of Westminster in 1931, which acknowledged Canada's co-equal status with the United Kingdom. Between the World Wars, Canada...
That was all the way in 1931. I didn't know that was so recent that happened.
was hit particularly hard during the Great Depression of the early 1930s, with unemployment rates reaching 25%, and many men living in unemployment relief camps. During the Second World War, over 1.1 million Canadians served in that brutal conflict that left nearly 100,000 of them dead or wounded. In 1949, Newfoundland became the last Canadian province to incorporate. In
1949. Really not that long ago.
1965, Canada adopted its current flag. Here's a selection of some of the other...
What year was the flag?
In 1965...
1965? 35, 50 years ago? Did they say 1975 or 1965?
Newfoundland became the last Canadian province to incorporate. In 1965...
1965. I'm not mathing right now. 35 plus 25-ish. Okay, it was more like 60 years ago. Not that long ago, the Canadian flag was made.
Canada adopted its current flag. Here's a selection of some of the other national flags that were proposed. Let me know in the comments of which one do you think looks best. In 1982, the Canada Act passed the Parliament of the United Kingdom and was ratified by the Queen, granting Canada the right to create their own constitution, which they...
Canada didn't have its own constitution until when?
Was ratified by the Queen.
What year?
1982, the Canada Act.
82? 1982? Now we're talking 40 years ago, Canada made a constitution. This is all so recent. I really didn't realize this.
Passed the Parliament of the United Kingdom and was ratified by the Queen, granting Canada the right to create their own constitution, which they promptly did. Still recognizing the constitutional monarchy in a mostly ceremonial rule, the new constitution abolished the British Parliament's remnants of influence over Canada. Canada is now a nation of over 36 million people, where over 20% speak French as a first language, and has the 10th largest economy in the world. The province of Quebec has maintained a strong French influence over the centuries, and has on 2 occasions voted in referendums to decide whether Quebec should proclaim national sovereignty and become an independent country. In 1995, it very nearly did not pass, with
Oh my God. It was that close? That's insane how close that was. You know, if Quebec wants to be independent, fine, that's not like insane to me. What's insane is how split this decision is. 50-50. Half the population wants it, at least at the time of this voting. That is incredible. Like, history could be so different, just based on a couple votes.
secession still being an issue till this day. This has been Epimetheus. Let me know.
Okay, there we go. Okay. That was the crash course in Canadian history. I think I got most of it. Yeah, I'm so glad I took some time to do this. Ton of stuff I either didn't remember or didn't know. Canada's fascinating history. And a lot of stuff that has to do with the United States that I, embarrassingly didn't remember. So that was good as well for me as an American to know. So Canada's got a cool, interesting history. This was a ton of fun to learn about. So anyway, if you enjoyed this as well, feel free to give this video a like or leave a comment with your thoughts on Canadian history. And if you're interested in more videos like this, me reacting to Canada and learning about Canadian culture, feel free to subscribe for more. And until then, thanks for watching, and see you next time.